Assalamu alaikum. Welcome to WCMIR monthly meeting. World Council of Muslims for Interfaith Relations, WCMIR, among other things, acts as an advisory body for the international Muslim community on different Islamic issues. Today, our lecture is going to be on LGBTQ, Muslims, and Islam. As you know, LGBTQ communities are increasingly posing a challenge to faith communities in general and Muslims in particular. While new laws are being made to safeguard their rights, Muslim organizations seem to have no policy to deal with LGBTQ issues. The topic covers an overview of the historical development of the LGBTQ communities, their challenges, Muslim LGBTQ communities, and the guidance provided by the Quran and the Sunnah. Our presenter today is Dr. Muhammad Ahmadullah Siddiqi. He needs no introduction. He has been part of the Chicago Muslim community for the last 50 years. I will just have a very short introduction. Dr. Siddiqi is Professor Emeritus of Journalism and Public Relations at Western Illinois University, where he has taught for 29 years. At WIU, he served as the Journalism Program Director and Chair of the Department of English and Journalism. Dr. Siddiqi is among the founding members of WCMIR and is currently serving as its board member and treasurer. He has authored several books and publications and published more than 24 peer-reviewed articles in different journals. I can go on, but with this, I will request Dr. Siddiqi, we will have the presentation first, and then after that, question and answers. So Dr. Siddiqi, please start.
Thank you, Dr. Tanveer Azmat. As you all know, that World Council of Muslims for Interfaith Relations organizes every month. In fact, the last Sunday of every month, a public forum, a monthly forum to discuss an issue of concern or an importance. I pray to Allah that He guides me through this presentation. I have been thinking about this issue for a long time as I travel to various Islamic centers and mosques, conferences and seminars in North America and Europe. I find that despite concern, a lot of Muslims, they don't have enough clarity on the issue that is rooted in Quran and Sunnah. But recently, there was a PowerPoint presentation at the Islamic Circle of North America Center, ICNA Center, in Oak Brook Terrace on February 11th by Dr. Sabil Ahmed, Director of Gain Peace, on this subject. But that presentation was mainly focused on transgender issues. So I thought that I should cover all of the various elements of the LGBTQ issues. Another motivation came from the challenges faced by various Islamic centers and not having a clarity on the issue or a clear-cut policy sometimes they are caught in a situation for which they don't have a clear answer. For example, in one of the mosques in Chicago area, a gay couple called and said they want to come and have Islamic nikah in the masjid. And that came as an upsetting and alarming issue for which they did not have any immediate response. I also find it difficult for many masajids to have Friday sermons on this issue, either because the imams lack the depth and the breadth of the issue and proper understanding, or they don't want to touch on an issue that is seemingly or apparently complex and delicate. So I have divided my presentation in 3 parts. First, I will talk about the LGBTQ issue, its definitions, how a historical perspective, and what are the legal safeguards that this community has in most of the Western countries, including North America. Then I will discuss about the LGBTQ Muslims and what are their opinions and how do they interpret the Qur'an and Sunnah on this issue. And finally, I will present to you my understanding of how Qur'an and Sunnah looks at this. Obviously, I am not a mufti, so I'm not going to give any fatwa during this presentation. I don't claim to be an Islamic scholar either. I just consider myself a student studying Islam and various related issues. So let's start with some discussion on the issue of LBGTQ. Many of you may know these terms as they are used in the contemporary environment. L stands for lesbians, who are women attracted emotionally or physically to other women. A woman does not need to have a specific sexual experience or any sexual experience to identify as lesbian. Gay initially meant male homosexual. Now gay is a term referring to people who practice or oriented to homosexuality in general. Bisexual persons emotionally, romantically, or sexually attracted to more than one sex, gender, or gender identity, though not necessarily simultaneously, in the same way or to the same degree. Transgenders are those people who identify themselves other than the gender of their birth. For example, a male may begin to identify himself as female and vice versa. This change in gender identity may be simply by change in appearance or through hormonal changes, surgery, or all of these. Queer refers to an adjective used by some people, particularly younger people, whose sexual orientation is not exclusively heterosexual. This term was once used a pejorative term and has been reclaimed by some but not all members of the LGBTQ community. Queer became increasingly used to describe a broad spectrum of non-normative sexual or gender identities and politics. In general, it may refer to the entire LBGT community. As far as historically, we find mention of homosexual orientation and behavior in many ancient literature, including the scriptures, Bible, and the Old Testament, New Testament, and Quran. We will discuss it later in detail. However, in contemporary history, we find its mention in many books, both fiction and literary. For example, in 1732, the term lesbian was first used by William King in his book, The Toast, published in England, which meant women who loved women. Hungarian journalist Karl Maria Kertnyi first used the term homosexual in 1869. The term gay was used throughout Europe earlier, but in 1955, the term gay came to mean same-sex relationship between men. In 1965, John Olivan, in his book, Sexual Hygiene and Pathology, used the term transgender to mean a person who identifies with a gender other than the one they were assigned at birth. Until 1973, the American Psychiatric Association, for example, declassified ego-syntonic homosexuality, the condition of a person content with his or her homosexuality, as a mental illness. According to Encyclopedia Britannica, in most of Africa, Asia, and Latin America, both the subject and behavior are considered taboo, with some slight exceptions made in urban areas. In Western countries, attitudes were somewhat more liberal. Although the topic of homosexuality was little discussed in the public forum during the early part of the 20th century, it became a political issue in many Western countries during the late 20th century. Due to more than 50 years of gay and lesbian activism, the LGBTQ community was successful in shifting the focus from this being a human rights issue rather than a religious issue. Many jurisdictions in North America, Europe, and Australia enacted laws banning discrimination against homosexuals, and an increasing number of employers in America and European countries agreed to offer domestic partners benefits similar to the healthcare, life insurance, and in some cases, pension benefits that were available to heterosexual married couples. Constitutional and legal protection. In 2003, the US Supreme Court ended sodomy laws nationwide, reversing its own ruling given in 1986. In 2013, the US Supreme Court agreed with the lower courts that the ban on federal recognition of same-sex couples was unconstitutional. The court decided to eliminate the portion of the Defense of Marriage Act of 1996 that defined marriage as a legal union between one man and one woman as husband and wife. In 2015, US Supreme Court decision in Obergefell versus Hodges case legalized gay marriages. There are currently 32 countries where same-sex marriage is legal, including Argentina, Australia, Austria, Belgium, Brazil, Canada, Chile, Colombia, Costa Rica, Denmark, Ecuador, Finland, France, Germany, Iceland, Ireland, Luxembourg, Malta, Mexico, the Netherlands, New Zealand, Norway, Portugal, Slovenia, South Africa, Spain, Sweden, Switzerland, Taiwan, the United Kingdom, the United States of America, and Uruguay. On the other hand, at least 67 countries have national laws criminalizing same-sex relations between consenting adults. On July 17, 2018, the Indian Supreme Court ruled the ban on gay rights as unconstitutional. Section 377 of the Indian Criminal Code was being rewritten. Many same-sex couples have filed petition in the top court to legalize same-sex marriage, although it is not yet legalized by the Indian Supreme Court, even though many high courts in India have called for sweeping reforms to respect LGBTQ rights. LGBT support from media, film, entertainment industries, and educational institutions. The Gay and Lesbian Alliance Against Defamation, GLAD, found that of the 118 major studio films released in 2019, at least 22, 18.6% contained characters who identified themselves as LGBT. Furthermore, more than 250 LGBT characters were counted in children's cartoons dating back to 1983. Looking at the data from 2010 through 2020, especially in the latter 5 years of this period, the representation of overly queer characters skyrocketed. In the years following gay marriage legalization, Sesame Street, SpongeBob, and other such cartoons were also featuring openly LGBT identifying characters. The LGBT narrative has also permeated at an institutional level with several states, especially the democratic-leaning states, mandating LGBT education in various public schools, some as early as elementary school. The focus of sex education curriculum can be summarized as, quote, gender is one of those things everyone thinks they understand, but most people don't. Like inception, gender isn't binary. It is not either or. In many cases, it is both, and a bit of this, a dash of that. So a young Muslim expresses his or her feeling like this, quote, I feel this internally, therefore I am an inauthentic person unless I am allowed to live my life according to this feeling. And if the Muslim community doesn't accept my sexual orientation, then they are rejecting me and undermining my dignity as a person, end of quote. So if one does not fully endorse homosexual behavior, relationships, and family structures, then one lacks respect for people's dignity, a serious moral charge. This loaded terminology is then used as a tool for social and political demonization of people who do not agree with LGBT way of thinking. A person who disagrees with this branding of human rights and human dignity is quickly labeled then as homophobic. This shift in paradigm took a couple of centuries to take place. During this time, Muslim scholars did not try to frame the issue challenging the paradigms of an evolving man-centered moral order. While at the same time, by the closing decades of the 19th century, Nietzsche was able to declare that for Western man at least, God is dead. When tracing the epistemology of the Western secular paradigm on sexual morality, we must bear in mind that the defining figures of today's Western ideologies were nearly all staunch atheists, such as Karl Marx, Friedrich Nietzsche, and Sigmund Freud. Scientific evidence for and against homosexuality. The American Psychiatric Association and the American Psychological Association have suggested for many years now that there is significant empirical evidence supporting the claim that homosexuality is a normal variant of human sexual orientation as opposed to a mental disorder. On the other hand, in a Scientific American magazine article published in 2019, massive study of about 500,000 people finds not a single evidence of a genetic cause for same-sex sexual behavior. The authors of the study conclude that the genetic similarities still cannot show whether a given individual is gay. An article published in the Scientist magazine on December 7, 2017 concludes that a genomic interrogation of homosexuality turns up speculative links between genetic elements and sexual orientation. But researchers say that the study is too small to be significant. The scientific research so far indicates that our DNA determines our gender. The binary X and Y chromosomes result in a male or female. XY chromosomes yield males, and XX chromosomes yield female genders. In exceptional cases, a person could be born without a specific gender identity. However, the current transgenderism has nothing to do with this exceptionality. It is by a specific desire or inclination of a person to change his or her gender of birth. In the journal Hormones and Behavior, volume 119, March 2020, the authors suggest that many scientific studies taken together have provided substantial support for biological influences underlying the development of sexual orientation. But questions remain unanswered, including how biological mechanisms may differ in contributing to men's and women's sexual orientation development. A Wall Street Journal columnist, Abigail Shrier, published a book in June 2020 titled Irreversible Damage, the Transgender Craze, Seducing Our Daughters. In this book, Shrier documents mental abuse and torture through which hundreds of transgender girls have to go through due to gender euphoria they are put in. Now let's turn our attention to the second part of the presentation, LGBTQ Muslims. There is no denying of the fact that homosexuality has been part of the Muslim societies since its existence. However, open LBGTQ communities are more rapidly emerging. The percentage of Muslims who identify themselves as queers or any of the LGBT is on the rise. In an article published in the Guardian newspaper on March 27, 2019, Saima Mir analyzes the dilemma of Muslim parents as sex education is fast changing in schools and colleges. Quoting Amanullah D. Sondi, a lecturer in contemporary Islam at University College Cork, she writes that the parents who are protesting want Islam to be black and white, but it isn't. He says, quote, Islamic traditions and commentaries are not clear, and they are not meant to be clear, because faith develops in uncertainty. The Qur'an is very fruitful ground for looking at diversity. It is not black and white. It allows for gray. End of quote. In many cities in America, Canada, and Europe, LGBTQ mosques are established. For example, in Chicago, there's a mosque called Masjid al-Rabia that opened its door in December 2016. Leila Fadel of National Public Radio did a feature on NPR about this mosque, Mosque on April 15, 2018. And you can Google and you can read the entire interview. You can listen to the entire interview of this NPR by Leila Fadel. The mosque is established inside the Grace Episcopal Church in downtown Chicago. The mission statement reads as, quote, to provide spiritual support for marginalized Muslims with healing justice practices in mind. The mosque offers Friday congregational prayer led by a woman imam, Mahdiya Lin, who is a transgender and converted to Islam. Men and women pray side by side, and the place is a resource center for LGBTQ community in the greater Chicago area. Some of the other LGBTQ mosque organizations and resource centers include Masjid al-Nur, Al-Islah Mosque, and Mecca Institute in Washington, D.C., Queer Muslim of Boston, Heaven the Inclusive Muslim Union of Philadelphia, Noor LBGTQIA Muslims of Seattle, Al-Tawheed Juma Circle, Toronto Unity Mosque, Muslims for Progressive Values, Los Angeles, Salam, Canada, Al-Jannah, UK, Confederation of Associations, LGBTQIA Euro-African or Muslim in France, Secret Gardens, Netherlands, and the Inner Circle in South Africa. In a recently conducted Pew Research Center study, it was found that 45% of the American Muslim respondents said homosexuality should be accepted, while 47% opposed it, and the rest had no opinions. The majority of those who supported were in the age group 18 to 29, and the majority that opposed were 65 years or older. There are more data along other parameters, such as ethnicity, race, and gender. And if you want to study in detail the Pew Research study on this topic, you can Google it, and it will direct you to the web link, and you can read it in its entirety. LGBTQ influences are rapidly increasing, especially among the young people in both Muslims and non-Muslim population. Even in countries that have legally banned LGBTQ expressions and organizations, the group is well organized and expanding. In a recent survey of the students at Cambridge University, more than half of the students identified themselves as LGBTQ. In Canada, one can be arrested for speaking against LGBTQ in public. In the US, mosques and Islamic centers are now approached by LGBTQ people for marriages and also for a space for them to meet and greet LGBT community. I found a 15-page illustrated guide with answers and questions and concerns about LGBTQ issues. The title of this resource book is I Am Muslim and I Might Not Be Straight, a resource for LGBTQ plus Muslim youth. And I'm just sharing a quote from the resource book. At the end of the day, remember that Allah made all of their creations with beauty and love in mind. Being queer does not make you any less Muslim or any less religious. You do not have to choose between your religion and your sexuality and gender. You can be queer and still be whatever type of Muslim you want to be. Allah made humans with a wide array of genders and sexualities, and they know their creations best. Queer Muslims are not a tragic story. We are real, valid, and exist in mosques and communities everywhere. If you ever feel conflicted or challenged by either your faith or community, remember this verse from the Qur'an. He who created the seven heavens, one above another, no want of proportions will thou see in the creation of the most gracious. So turn thy vision again. Do you see any flaw? These are verses 3 and 4 from Surah Al-Mulk. Always remember Allah has 99 names, and one of them is most merciful. Allah is Al-Rahman and Al-Rahim. End of the quote. In May of 2022, during Canada's International Days Against Homophobia, Transphobia, and Biophobia, LGBT Nation, a Muslim organization, summarized in the following words its understanding of Islamic position on homosexuality. Quote, Muslim culture isn't inherently anti-gay. The Quran says nothing about homosexuality, unlike the Bible. Islamic history is filled with texts openly depicting homosexuality as a beautiful, matter-of-fact thing. And more American Muslims support same-sex marriage than do Christian evangelicals, Protestants, and Mormons, according to a Pew Research study. End of the quote. The framing of the article as a whole, from its title to its final paragraph, portrays Muslims who objected to the poster in which two hijabi Muslim women were shown kissing each other as unnecessarily homophobic. They were protesting a beautiful thing that their own religious scripture supposedly does not condemn and that their own history has allegedly celebrated for centuries. So this is how the Muslim LGBT community looks at their sexual orientation, their understanding of how the Quran guides them towards spirituality and religion itself. Now I am coming towards the last part of my presentation. What I think Islam says about LGBTQ. In this section, I will review the Islamic guidance on the issue from three sources that form the foundation of understanding about LGBTQ. First, the Quran, then the Sunnah, and then the Ijma, consensus of Islamic scholars. The Prophet, in his farewell sermon, reminded Muslims that he was leaving behind two things, the Quran and the Sunnah. And as long as Muslims adhere to these two sources, they will remain on the path of Islam. Quran also underlines this in Surah Al Imran, chapter 3, in verse number 103. وَاعْتَصِمُوا بِحَبْلِ اللَّهِ جَمِيعًا وَلَا تَفَرَّقُوا. And hold together firmly the rope of Allah and do not create divisions among yourselves. The discourse on homosexuality has shifted so quickly and radically that the old Muslim defenses and attitudes, it is not our problem. How is this different for us Muslims from fornication or wine drinking or live and let live? Have become ineffective. And we are confronted with grave challenges. Most well-meaning and sincere Muslims are either complacent, helpless, or both. They fail to realize that unlike the haram acts of drinking alcohol and illicit heterosexual sex, the affirmation of same-sex relationship and transgenderism is presented as a positive moral cause, undergirded by contentious metaphysical assumptions regarding, among other things, the human self, the place of sex and sexuality, human identity, and the proper balance between the individual and society. It is a discourse that appeals to universal notions of human dignity, justice, respect, and the discourse on homosexuality has shifted so quickly and radically that the old Muslim defenses and attitudes have become ineffective, and we are confronted with grave challenges. Most well-meaning and sincere Muslims are either complacent, helpless, or both. They fail to realize that, unlike the haram acts of drinking alcohol and illicit heterosexual sex, the affirmation of same-sex relationships and transgenderism is presented as a positive moral cause, undergirded by contentious metaphysical assumptions regarding, among other things, the human self, the place of sex and sexuality in human identity, and the proper balance between the individual and society. It is a discourse that appeals to universal notions of human dignity, justice, respect, and autonomy. Only by engaging with these issues holistically can we properly understand and respond to this challenge. When we answer to a young gay Muslim that it is haram, we ignore the fact that our answer is rooted in the Islamic worldview of morality, where his question and understanding of his sexual orientation is based on the secular worldview in which he has been raised. Muslims must therefore establish and advocate for the Islamic paradigm of gender and sexuality over and against modern, postmodern perversions. In contrast to man-centered morality, the Islamic morality is God-centered. Let me repeat this. In contrast to man-centered morality, the Islamic-centered morality is God-centered. According to the Qur'an and Sunnah, sexual pleasure is not intrinsically evil, nor is it strictly for the proliferation of the human race. Rather, when enjoyed in legitimate ways, it is a blessing, even a sign of God's favor upon his creation. Prophet Muhammad, peace and blessings be upon him, once told his companions that they would be rewarded for fulfilling their sexual desires lawfully with their wives. Now, I just want to compare the differences in attitude and belief about our sexual orientation between the man-centered moral universe and the God-centered moral universe. So in a man-centered moral universe, freedom in popular culture is understood as the radical elimination of external barriers to achieve maximum happiness. In Islam, however, freedom is based on servitude to Allah, submission to Allah, which frees us from serving our desires, material things, and falsehood. In the man-centered moral universe, the West's notion of autonomy literally means giving oneself the law, giving yourself the law. You can do what you want to do, whereby each person determines what is right and wrong without recourse to a higher power. On the other hand, in Islam, God alone is the lawgiver. Obeying God and his messenger is the foundation of any legislation in Islam. In the man-centered moral universe, authenticity comes. The modern West defines authenticity as complete, unfettered expression of the inner self, thoughts, feelings, and desires. In Islam, we are our true authentic selves as human beings only when we have found and submitted to our Creator in consonance with our fitra, that is natural or inborn inclination. In the man-centered morality, choice and consent, any action a person takes is legitimized by his choice or her consent to do it, so long as there is no harm to others. And this is especially the case for sexual activity. In contemporary culture, notions of moral character, and particularly any consideration of virtue, are deemed antiquated, old-fashioned, and unnecessary for the cultivation of authentic selfhood. In this vein, how a person behaves sexually has no bearing on his or her moral character as long as the acts are consensual. Given the postmodern premise that all notions are socially constructed, the emphasis on consent as the fulcrum of moral validity is utterly incoherent. On the other hand, in Islam, choice and consent are balanced through revelation and reason that is critical to human flourishing, such as the maintenance of the family, the cultivation of piety, and the repeated divine command to enjoin good and forbid evil. Now, let's see what Islam says about Islam and gender. Quran is unambiguously clear that God had created only two genders, male and female. For example, in chapter 49, verse number 13, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, Ya ayyuhan nasu inna khalaqnakum min zakarin wa unsa. That, O humankind, we have created you from two genders, male and female. The Islamic paradigm for gender and sexuality is reflected in a number of verses. For example, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, and by his creation of the male and female. In another place he says, and that he created the two male mates, the male and female. At another place he says, and the male is not like the female. At another place he says, and of his science is that he created for you spouses from among yourselves so that you may find comfort in them. And he has placed between you compassion and mercy. Surely in this are signs of people who reflect. These verses recognize two genders, distinct yet complementary in nature. Unlike what has been quoted in the Muslim LGBT resource book, that there is no clarity in Quran, Quran is very clear that in nature, Allah created a male and female, and from them, he has created all the human beings that were created by intentional design to be companions of one another. In another verse, Allah Almighty stresses both the uniqueness of men and women as well as their spiritual equality. And Allah says, sure, Muslim men and women, then he says, believing men and women, devout men and women, truthful men and women, patient men and women, humble men and women, charitable men and women, fasting men and women who guard their chastity, and men and women who remember Allah. For all of them, Allah has prepared forgiveness and great reward. In the following, Allah declares men and women and as companions and as wali. For example, in verse number 35 of chapter 33, he says the believing men and the believing women are allies of one another. They enjoin what is right and forbid what is wrong, and establish prayer and give zakat. In Surah Al-Nisa, verse 32, Allah teaches us not to compete for the same roles and responsibilities, but rather to work alongside one another in enjoining good, forbidding evil, and forming communities.
Recording in progress.
And forming communities that exalt the divine command, where Allah says, and do not wish for that by which Allah has made some of you exceed others. For men is a share of what they have earned, and for women there is a share of what they have earned. And ask Allah of His bounty. Indeed, Allah is knower of all the things, and He is all-knowing. Despite their spiritual equality, men and women are different on a practical level. They have different roles, rights, and responsibilities that guide how they interact in the domestic sphere and in society at large. Therefore, the slogan, "My body, my choice," does not fit the Islamic paradigm and challenges God's supreme moral authority. Now, I just want to share with you what Qur'an says in particular about homosexuality, because it has been said again and again in documentaries, in Muslim LGBT resource book, that there is nothing in Quran. Rather, at one place in one of the resource book that I was looking at, it says that about the story of Lut, what has been condemned in Quran is rape, not the consensual homosexual relationship between men. Many liberal academics and the so-called Muslim LGBTQ community claim that there is nothing against homosexuality in the Quran. They claim that what Quran condemns is not homosexuality or consensual sexual relations between men, but rape. This claim is without any merit and misleading. Let us look at the story of the people of Lut. Quran has mentioned this story in varying details in many chapters. One can only say that the claim that Quran condemned only rape is far from the truth and far-fetched conclusion. Now, I'm not going to read all the verses and its translation, but here are the references. In chapter 26, Surah Shu'ara, verses 160 to 175, 16 verses, in detail talk about how God has condemned this event and this type of sexual behavior. In chapter 7, Surah Al-Araf, verses 80 to 84. In chapter 11, Surah Hud, verse 74 to 83. In chapter 15, Surah Al-Hijr, verses 57 to 77. In chapter 21, Surah Al-Anbiya, verses 71 to 75. In chapter 27, Surah Al-Naml, verses 54 to 58. In chapter 29, Surah Al-Ankabut, verses 28 to 35. In chapter 37, Surah Safat, verses 133 to 135. And in chapter 54, Surah Al-Qamar, verses 33 to 39. So these are the 9 chapters in which Allah has described, commented, and has said very clearly how God Himself looked as homosexual relationship. In the wake of such harsh criticism and condemnation of this act of fahsha, as described by God Himself, It is impossible for a faithful believer to say that Quran does not condemn homosexuality. I will present here just one example from Surah Al-Naml, chapter 27, verse 54 to 58, in which not only Allah condemns the obscene acts of the people of Lut alayhi salam, but also describe the most severe punishment that Allah has given them by destroying the entire city and the entire people who were left behind. And this is the translation of these 5 verses from chapter 27, Surah Al-Naml. And remember, Lut alayhi salam, when he said to his people, do you engage in obscene activities which you understand that they are indeed obscene? Do you satisfy your sexual lust with men instead of women? In fact, you are an ignorant or foolish people. So his people had no other answer to give except that they said, expel the family of Lut from your town, since they pretend to be clean and pure people. So we, means Allah, saved him and his family, except his wife. Then Allah destined her to be among those who remained behind for punishment. And we, means Allah, rained down on them a rain of stones of baked clay. What an evil rain it was for people who were warned of this punishment beforehand. So we find that in addition to Quran, in Hadith literature also, there is no ambiguity about it. And here are a few of the many ahadiths that I am sharing with you. Narrated by Ibn Abbas radiallahu anhu, the Prophet, peace be upon him, cursed the homosexual people, those people who are in the similitude, men and women, those women who assume the manners of men. And he said, turn them out of your houses. And the Prophet turned out such and such men, and Umar turned out such and such men. Sahih al-Bukhari from chapter 7, section 72, hadith number 774. And the Sahih hadith narrated by Abdullah ibn Abbas, which is narrated similarly in Sunan Abu Dawud. Same way we find hadith in Ibn Majah, Tirmizi, and many other books of hadith. And I'm not here sharing any hadith that has been graded less than Sahih. There are many more hadiths with similar instructions and clearly making it a forbidden act. As far as I know, in all 5 schools of jurisprudence, including the Jafri Fiqh, there is consensus that any form of homosexuality is not permitted in Islam. The only type of sexual relations allowed is between a man and a woman through the institution of marriage. Any sexual relations, even between a man and woman, outside of marital relationship is also haram and is called zina or adultery. I also want to state that to the best of my knowledge, the Fiqh Council of North America, the American Association of Muslim Jurists and Imams, ISNA, ICNA, Mosque, etc., all view this as an act not permissible by Allah and His Prophet. Let's now turn our attention to developing a strategy to combat this issue. Islam and homosexuality, what can we do? A plan of action. It is very clear that both Allah and His Prophet loved human beings. It is because of Allah's mercy and love of His creation that He guided us to Islam and permitted us to do certain things and forbade us from certain acts and behaviors. So Our efforts should be based on love, compassion, and concern to people, and not on hate or vengeance. The Islamic centers and mosques need to develop a clearly written policy on this issue after a thorough consultation among scholars, attorneys, Muslim counselors, and psychiatrists. The focus of our argument should be based on God-centered moral principles. We should have the current resources available to our imams and khatibs and school teachers and administrators. Muslim community in North America operate more than 100 schools from KG to 12th grade. We should explore the possibility of sex education within an Islamic framework in those schools as well as in many of our weekend schools. We should have programs to support and help transition to those among us who have fallen to LGBT narrative but still are searching for God's mercy. Although a difficult topic, but our khatibs should address this issue in our Friday khutbahs. Muslim organizations, mosques, and Islamic centers should have a zero tolerance policy against those who commit such acts within the system. Every mosque and Islamic organization should have a well-defined sexual harassment policy. WCMIR has developed a policy and can provide a copy to people and organizations interested. We should form effective alliances with other faith communities for public pronouncement of the core values of God-centered morality. The Parliament of the World Religions has developed a global ethic forum in which they had tried to formulate the moral principles that are rooted in faith, whether it is Islam or Christianity or Judaism, Hinduism, other faiths, and bring it together so that all faith communities can stand together in propagating those values that should form the basis of our discourse with the fellow human beings wherever we live. At the end, I would like to thank all of the people whose resources I have used in this presentation, especially a similar presentation given by Dr. Sabeel Ahmed, as I mentioned in the beginning. I have greatly benefited from Yaqeen's international article, Islam and the LGBT question, Reframing the Narrative, and a short video by Sheikh Umar Sulaiman on the same subject. I have also benefited by Wahid Jensen, A Way Beyond the Rainbow, and also a 1-hour documentary by Matt Walsh. Is a very interesting documentary. What is a Woman? It is a 2020 American online documentary film about gender and transgender issues presented by the political commentator Matt Walsh. Also, there is a book on transgender issues by a commentator, Abigail Shrier, Irreversible Damage, the Transgender Craze, Seducing Our Daughters, published by Regency Press in 2022. If you like me to share with you these resources, please write down your email in the chat box, and I will send you these resources later on. I thank you very much for patiently hearing me, and I hope that on the three segment of my presentation, the LGBTQ narrative, as I understand, the Muslim LGBTQ, as I looked at it, and what, in my understanding, the Qur'an and the Sunnah and the consensus, the ijma, the consensus of the Muslim Ummah in 1400 plus years have said, written on this issue. أقول قولي هذا أستغفر الله لي ولكم ولسائر المسلمين والحمد لله رب العالمين. Thank you very much again.